Welcome to the 64th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regained Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Along with my co-host, Raven McNamee, I host this podcast series to help explore the applications of artificial intelligence in climate solutions.
Thanks, Sanjoy. I'm Raven, a specialist in data, AI, and sustainability recruitment across UK and US markets.
Our guest for today is Helen Jackson, the director of ClimateNode, which is using artificial intelligence to monitor climate-related risks. Welcome, Helen.
Hello, thanks very much for having me on the podcast.
So, Helen, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I started out in life as a physicist. So I originally thought I was going to be a climate scientist and started a PhD in atmospheric physics. I decided academia wasn't for me, so I got a job in consultancy working on advising clients on emissions trading. And this is what got me first interested in environmental economics. I decided to get a formal qualification in environmental economics, and then I spent several years doing environment, climate, and energy economics and policy analysis in a consultancy context. So I was one of the first people to work for the world-leading climate and energy economics consultancy, Vivid Economics, which is now part of McKinsey. And I have many years' experience working on high-spec, technically demanding research projects for national governments, MDBs, and so on. I took a career break after that to look after my young daughter. During this time, I did an online learning course, getting a formal qualification in software engineering and data modeling. And then I was still freelancing when my daughter was young. And one of the organizations I worked with was the Climate Bonds Initiative. And this is an organization which is trying to devise tractable rules for flagging whether assets linked to bonds are low carbon and climate resilient. And it was during that time that I really started to think about the issue of how difficult it is to assess whether an asset is actually climate resilient and how difficult it is to get a handle on climate risk. There can be a lot of geographical, socioeconomic context, whether infrastructure is being maintained, what adaptation policies are in place, what's happening with water management in a particular location, and so on. And so for me, it raised the question, how could you begin to compile that information in an efficient and systematic way? And that led me to experiment with natural language processing for trying to compile climate risk information. And that is what ClimateNode is doing now.
Thanks for that introduction, Helen. Really interesting to hear about your background. So it's kind of looking forward. Tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do at ClimateNode in more detail.
Well, ClimateNode is building AI-based tools for physical risk intelligence. So obviously in the financial world, people categorize climate risk in two ways. They talk about transition risk. So that's the risk associated with the switch away from fossil fuels. So sudden drops in oil demand, that kind of thing, and physical risk. So that's the risks associated with the physical impacts of climate change themselves. And as we all know, climate change is accentuating hazards, placing strains on the systems underpinning human welfare, whether that's infrastructure, built environment, agriculture, natural capital, and so on. People need information on evolving climate risks to plan and make adaptation decisions, whether that's in public policy, business, or financial institutions. So there's a growing market in climate information services, and there's been quite a lot of effort put in to trying to get a handle on climate risk and various quantitative techniques that people use to do this. So what I am trying to do with ClimateNode is say, hang on a minute, okay, we've got these quantitative techniques, but there are things which they're not capturing well, if at all. They're not capturing all hazards, how hazards interact. They don't capture the knock-on impacts of climate-related hazards for the economy. They don't capture public health risks very well or ecological risk. It's also very difficult to capture information on vulnerability and adaptation, information which is relating to the local geographic or socioeconomic context. ClimateNode is looking at whether we can capture this kind of information using NLP. So looking at information which is specific to particular places and assets and companies and economic sectors, and then seeing if we can use that information as context for quantitative models and kind of supplementing them, thinking through the kinds of things they may be missing.
Helen, you started talking a little bit about multiple risks and how they interact with each other. But I know in one big project that you have been doing is analyzing urban flooding in the UK, right?
That's correct.
And can you tell us a little bit about the results of that analysis and to whom it could be useful?
Okay, so if I just backtrack slightly, the first project which ClimateNode did was a very general flood impact analysis, looking at how flooding had affected UK communities and individual sectors such as transport, healthcare, education, farming, and so on, since 2007. And this was looking at all types of flooding, so river flooding, coastal flooding, surface water flooding, as well as related hazards. Now, one of the things that really stood out for me doing that project was just how little we are paying attention to surface water flooding. So this is flooding which occurs purely because the rate of rainfall has overwhelmed the drainage system in a place. It can happen anywhere where there's impermeable surfaces. It doesn't need to be anywhere near a water body. And this is an increasing problem in the UK now. We've had some very serious urban flash flood events in London, for example, particularly bad news for people living in basement apartments. There have been some life-threatening situations. One of the problems with surface water flooding is that it doesn't get a lot of media attention as an issue, or political attention for that matter. These events can be very, very localized and they can be over quite quickly. So whereas the news will cover our major winter storm events very well, people don't realize the extent of surface water flooding. And I wanted to draw attention to that issue. And I was also very, very aware that our historic data is not very good, because with something like surface water flooding, you can't pick up on the extent of the flood from a satellite image, for example, very easily. The aim of the project was to map out the most detailed level possible what the impacts had been from summertime urban flash flood events using local newspaper reports, so right down to street and asset level. And this project analysed about 17,000 articles from around 300 individual websites, picking up on mentions of flooding occurring, as I said, at street asset level, road junctions, things like that, trying to ascertain kind of what had happened on these individual days where we had had major urban flash flood events. Now, in terms of outcomes, I've had a number of conversations with hydrologists and meteorologists and others engaged in flood research, and it has been suggested to me that this type of data could be very useful in evaluating flood warnings and forecasts. That's particularly the case for surface water flooding. So one academic researching sub-daily rainfall and surface water flooding told me that these sorts of observations derived from text are critical from their work in verifying forecasts around surface water flood events. Anything that helps improve the very patchy record of observations that we have is very welcome. And another told me that the kind of data derived by the Urban Flash Flooding in England project would have been invaluable to his research on rainfall extremes. I think this project was a kind of demonstration of what we can do. I hope it may be useful to people researching surface water flooding and extreme rainfall in the UK. I'm certainly open to building on the data set in future. I was asked to present ClimateNode's work on flooding to an event organised by one of the major insurers last week. So I'm also very open to talking to insurers, and I'll see if there's any follow-on from that.
Okay, so we've talked quite a lot about the flooding. So it'd be great to hear about any other plans to for ClimateNode to maybe take into account other hazards, and if you've got plans on expanding beyond flooding.
Certainly. So ClimateNode's ambition is to be routinely scanning world news, scientific papers, and high-quality reports like national climate risk assessments for information on how climate-related hazards are materializing, the impacts they're having on economic activity and human welfare. And the flooding projects were really just to kind of build up capacity to do this and to test the idea out. And I think it's highly applicable to all types of hazards. So that's the plan now. And I'll be hoping to build and implement this in 2024.
And use of artificial intelligence, is it restricted to natural language processing? Because there could be many other applications of artificial intelligence in your type of work, right?
Yes. So there are a broad range of applications for AI in climate research. If people are interested in exploring that for themselves, I recommend they look at a website called Climate Change AI, which will give them more details on that. One of the more mainstream applications of AI in climate research is improving the efficiency of climate and weather models. For example, if you can take some of the physics out of a climate or a weather model and use machine learning instead, then you can reduce the amount of compute you need for that model. So that's a more kind of mainstream approach. ClimateNode may well use other types of AI in future, but for the moment, it is focusing on natural language processing. That's the thing that inspires me personally, and I don't think there are many other people doing it. So that's the reason why ClimateNode has found a niche doing that.
And by natural language processing, you mean what you said earlier, right? Scanning newspaper reports, scanning websites to come up with data about events and hazards as they occurred.
Yeah, that's one of the things you can do with it. Natural language processing is the subfield of AI which relates to getting computers to understand and analyze and interpret and generate human language. And obviously, it's received a huge amount of attention over the past year since the launch of ChatGPT. So most people have now come across natural language processing and had a play with ChatGPT and have some understanding of what the kind of most advanced things you can do with natural language processing are. As a subfield, it's been around a lot longer, and there are more kind of basic, long-standing techniques within it as well. ClimateNode uses a combination of techniques. Three main techniques. The first of these is something called text classification. So this is assigning categories to texts as a whole. So for example, in the urban flash flooding project, I didn't have a list of urban flash flood events to help me look for articles. I had to categorize the articles which were about urban flash flooding as opposed to other types of flooding in order to be able to identify the events themselves. So it can help with putting your article into a broad category in terms of what it is about. Now, the second technique is something called named entity recognition. So this is assigning categories to words or groups of words within texts. People often use this technique to look for things like place names, product names, company names, things like that. Anything that is going to be used consistently, semantically and syntactically within a sentence. So you can train a named entity recognition model to look for whatever you want, as long as it's something which is going to be kind of used consistently within text. So ClimateNode has experimented with training them to look for hazards, for example. And then the third technique is something called retrieval augmented generation. So this is a technique where you are building up a library of documents which you know you are interested in, and then using large language models to interrogate those documents. If you ask ChatGPT a question about climate-related hazards, it's going to give you quite a cogent answer, but it's going to be very general, and it is not going to admit it when it doesn't know something. And it tends to gloss over geographies as well. So these answers are not very useful. But you can build up a library of, for example, scientific papers or newspaper articles and ask questions about the things you know those documents contain. And for example, ClimateNode has experimented with using these techniques to pick up on individual factories belonging to companies being flooded, researching the impacts of extreme weather events on companies. You can ask it questions about the scientific literature. You can ask it, how is a particular hazard in a particular place going to evolve over time according to the scientific literature, and so on and so on. So it's basically it's building your own kind of ChatGPT, but just not using its inherent knowledge, but looking at things that you know you are interested in.
Right. It's a follow-up question, Helen. The way you explained various techniques of natural language processing is very interesting. But on your last point about the ChatGPT looking at a specific useful documents which you know are useful, there is a bit of training of the software, right? Artificial intelligence systems need to be trained. And how do you train artificial intelligence systems like the one you're trying to build?
For the retrieval augmented generation system, you're using someone else's large language model. If you're satisfied with the results that is giving, then you don't need to train your own model. People working in very specific domains sometimes do try to alter large language models so that it's more kind of suited for answering questions about that domain. That's a process called fine-tuning, but that's not something that ClimateNode has done so far. I don't think it's necessary at this stage in ClimateNode's work, but it's something I may look at in future. But for the text classification, for example, I had to train that model. So you just have to have a set of articles which you know are relevant to the different categories, and then you train the model on those. So there is some labeling involved. You train the model and you can evaluate its performance.
So you talked a bit earlier about the limitations of historical data and how other methods of data collection can be highly beneficial through the implementation of NLP, which is commendable, as you said. It's a very niche approach to this particular topic. So it'd be great to understand a bit more about how you model and measure other factors such as urban quality and quality of life in affected areas.
It's important to clarify that ClimateNode is not in the business of quantitative modelling in any form. ClimateNode's work is 100% focused on picking up on information in text. So I'm interested in looking at different causes for the events that we're observing. And the reason for that is because for many extreme weather events, there will be some degree of doubt over whether climate change has contributed to that event. Now, that's something which can only really be determined through formal scientific study, something called attribution science. But I think as the casual observer, it's really worth noting that whenever we see an extreme weather event, it's not necessarily the case that climate change is the main factor in that event. There are various other things going on in any location which could be contributing to that event. So things like urbanization, land use change, subsidence. There's large parts of the world, particularly in Asia, where groundwater extraction is giving rise to subsidence. This is particularly noticeable somewhere like Java. People often see the kind of relative sea level rise, which is happening in Java, and they immediately blame it on climate change. But in actual fact, the subsidence due to groundwater extraction is the magnitude is much greater than sea level rise. So ClimateNode has this philosophy that we need to be looking for those other things that are happening, which could exacerbate climate-related hazards as well.
Helen, one thing is to analyze, right? But the other thing is to be able to predict.
Yeah.
Predict using climate risks, but also predict issues which I'm acutely conscious about, which is non-climatic stresses like subsidence, right?
Yeah.
How do you move from the analysis to the prediction?
Yeah, ClimateNode is really not in the business of hazard prediction or quantitative model. It's in the business of processing large volumes of text to find nuggets of information on how risks are materializing and how they could evolve and the economic and human welfare implications. And the suggestion is that that can complement quantitative methods. The kinds of quantitative models that people are using to analyze the economic and financial impacts of climate change are missing out a lot of things. And this is about just trying to pick up on those other things, at least being aware that they exist and there are things that are not incorporated in quantitative models. So, for example, quantitative models don't incorporate the knock-on impacts or the economic knock-on impacts of climate-related hazards very well. So I'll give you an example. When Durban experienced historic floods in 2022, their wastewater infrastructure was badly damaged. This meant the beaches were polluted by sewage, the beaches were closed, and this hits tourism. I'll give you another example. I will be very surprised if any of the quantitative models being used to assess climate risk in the financial world are factoring in the possibility that Mediterranean tourism will be hit by climate change. And this could have really profound socioeconomic consequences in particular places which are very tourism dependent. It's not a direct impact. It's about picking up on the fact that there's going to be long-term behavioural change. These kinds of indirect impacts that we're not very good at modelling are rife. When you start really looking at the news stories which tell you how climate risks are materializing and how they're affecting economic life, you see these kinds of knock-on impacts all the time, and we need to be aware that they exist. So quantitative models don't incorporate things like dependence of industries on electricity grids which are being strained by heat waves, or manufacturing hubs which are heavily dependent on hydropower which is being curtailed due to drought. We've seen this in Guangdong in China, for example. The idea is to be picking up on these kinds of things that are actually happening and to use them as supplementary evidence when we're using quantitative models to think through what climate change is going to do to the economy and to individual sectors and to individual companies. Because we need to understand that a risk not accounted for in a quantitative model is still a risk, and we need to be horizon scanning for those risks and paying attention to what's actually happening and not just looking at projections.
Great. I think this is a very elaborate answer. I know you said that your ambition is to be a global source of scanning data for all types of hazards. But in the next 1 or 2 years, what are the type of milestones that you have set for yourself?
That's a really good question. Okay, so number one milestone, I need to secure at least one major commercial client. And I've had some interesting conversations within the past couple of weeks around that, and I hope get a positive outcome from those conversations. Number two, I need to recruit. So obviously, I can't develop this system by myself. I've got reasonable software engineering skills, but I need colleagues to help me develop this to be able to do it at scale. And number three, secure the funding to be able to hire those colleagues. I think those are my most immediate milestones.
So you've set yourself up as a non-profit at the moment. I mean, talk to us a little bit about what led you to that decision.
I am very conscious that there is a public good aspect to climate risk information. I think it is problematic if climate risk information is only available to those with the deepest pockets. There are obvious non-commercial uses for this type of analysis, which I'm personally interested in. I'm very keen to put information in the public domain where possible. Being a not-for-profit also helps build trust with academics. So ClimateNode is open to both commercial and non-commercial projects and partners. I mean, the bottom line is I felt it would be morally something I would struggle with to be profiting from analysing how climate change is affecting other people's lives and making other people's lives difficult.
The point that you mentioned of the mission of a non-profit is well understood, but you also have to raise money. And as you said, do you worry that as a non-profit, you will not have access to the types of funds that maybe a for-profit organization in your industry would have?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been aware of from the outset, and it was a deliberate choice. Obviously, as a non-profit, I can't attract venture capital, for example. The upside of that is more independence. There are other sources of funding. I am going to be looking to secure UK research and innovation funding as a company limited by guarantee. I'm still eligible for that. And I have had conversations with a couple of funders which are in the bag, so to speak. They may be interested in providing funding in future.
Thanks for talking about that, Helen. I think your conscious choice to be a non-profit, as you said, you're doing good, and climate is a holistic problem that all of us are facing. So being able to make that information public is, I think, something that's really important in this particular field.
If people want to get in touch with you, how should they?
They can get in touch with me either via LinkedIn, or they can go to the ClimateNode website. That's www.climatenode.org, and they can find a contact email there. Or alternatively, they can contact me by ringing the reception desk at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And thank you very much, Helen, for being a guest today.
Yes, Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks very much.